Another year, another batch of video games that failed to live up to their own hype. You'd think by now that we'd have learned not to get our hopes up too high about upcoming video game releases, and although we do temper our expectations where we can, each year there are still games that look promising prior to release that blow us away with their mediocrity when they actually launch. You'll be glad to know that 2023 had plenty of titles that did just that, and we're here to tell you all about them and ring the shame bell in their direction today. For this list, we're taking a look back at the video game offerings from the past 12 months that didn't exactly live up to our expectations. They're not necessarily bad games, not all of them anyway, just not what we were hoping for. Before we get into it, just a reminder that these are our opinions, and if you don't agree, then that's fine. Just be civil in the comments. Okay, who am I kidding? You're already furious. I'm Ben from TripleJump, and here are the 10 most disappointing games of 2023. Number 10. Starfield. Right, before you light the torches and start brandishing pitchforks in my direction, just hear me out, okay? Starfield isn't bad. On the contrary, in fact, it's really quite good. What we were all promised, though, was Skyrim in space, and I don't think it's unfair to say that Starfield is nowhere near as good as Skyrim. Set in the year 2330, Starfield sees players taking control of a player-created silent protagonist who must explore the galaxy in order to collect a bunch of mysterious artifacts, all whilst aided by a group known as the Constellation. Many aspects of Starfield impressed critics and players alike. The expansive world that Bethesda had created, along with the varied and creative missions and an outstanding score, were praised by reviewers. However, the game had a number of flaws that players simply couldn't overlook. Firstly, Starfield is a Bethesda game, and so naturally there were multiple bugs and glitches present in the initial release. Furthermore, players found the story to be on the dull side, the characters one note, and the space exploration lacking in grandiosity. It's all well and good having 1,000 planets to explore as long as they're all worth exploring, and we're not convinced that Starfield has that latter point nailed. Number 9. Fire Emblem Engage. Another game that reviewed rather well but still managed to disappoint players was January 2023's Fire Emblem Engage, the follow-up to Fire Emblem Three Houses. Engage is the 17th installment in the Fire Emblem franchise and centers on Allier, a dragon in human form who awakens from a short 1,000-year nap and quickly finds themselves embroiled in a conflict with the forces of the fell dragon Sombron. They must travel the land to recruit allies, and it's up to players to control Allier's army against Sombron's undead forces and the rival kingdom of Elusia. The turn-based combat was generally well received by critics and players alike, as Engage had further refined the mechanics seen in previous games. In that sense, Engage was better than its predecessors, but it fell short in more or less every other area. Most agreed that the plot was flimsy, nonsensical, and overused tired tropes, and that it was let down when compared to the narrative in Three Houses. There was also little love for the setting, which was again compared unfavorably to that of its predecessor. As turn-based RPGs go, Fire Emblem Engage isn't the worst in the world, but it's also certainly not the best either. Number 8. Diablo 4. Oh, we've got another contentious one for you now. Released in June 2023, Diablo 4 takes place some 50 years after the events of Diablo 3 Reaper of Souls, by which time cultists have summoned Lilith, the daughter of Mephisto. With the forces of demons and angels depleted, Lilith has been able to establish power over Sanctuary, and it's up to the player character, a barbarian, sorcerer, rogue, druid, or necromancer, to put a stop to her. The game did please many critics, boasting an average review score of 91 out of 100 on Metacritic and receiving compliments for its story, visuals, and level design. Not everyone was sold on Diablo 4, however, with many players voicing their disappointment. Part of the problem, according to fans, is that the game is something of a middle ground between an ARPG and an MMO, but doesn't fully succeed at either. It also feels, in places, like a vehicle for microtransactions, which wouldn't be a massive crime if it were free to play, but the base game costs the best part of £60, making the additional monetization feel rather cheeky on Blizzard's part. Considering the decade-long wait fans had to endure for Diablo 4, it feels like something of a letdown. Still, at least it's better than Diablo Immortal. Number 7. Star Wars Jedi Survivor. Released in 2019, Star Wars Jedi Fallen Order was a great title for fans of George Lucas's galaxy far, far away, and whilst it had its flaws, it is thought of rather fondly by the Star Wars gaming community. Whilst it garnered similar review scores, however, the game's follow-up seems to have been much more of a disappointment to fans than its predecessor. Star Wars Jedi Survivor takes place 5 years after the events of Fallen Order and sees Jedi Knight Cal Kestis once again squaring up to the Empire to try and put an end to their tyrannical reign. Survivor actually did quite well with critics and even outscored Fallen Order on Xbox Series and PS5, however many still felt that it didn't quite live up to its full potential. The vast majority of reviewers enjoyed the visuals, but there were some who found the story to be somewhat bland and the combat lacking when facing multiple enemies at once. The title also had a plethora of issues on PC, where players reported frame rates as low as 15 FPS in places. EA released a day one patch to help improve performance, but they did also blame the issues on players' operating systems, so basically took no accountability for the problems at all. Classic EA, really. Number 6. Atomic Heart. You know when you're out and about with your mum and you've just got a hankering for some Bioshock, so you ask if you can get Bioshock for dinner and your mum tells you that you've got Bioshock at home? This is the Bioshock at home. Atomic Heart takes place in the 1950s in an alternate history version of the Soviet Union, which is depicted as a sort of futuristic utopia with artificially intelligent robots. Naturally, the AI goes bad, and the place quickly becomes a dystopia where the robots revolt, as all AI will likely do sometime in the future. I'm watching you, Alexa. The game itself got a somewhat mixed response from players. Some rather liked it, with one critic calling it deeply ambitious, highly imaginative, and consistently impressive, whilst many others felt that it fell short when compared to the games it was influenced by, primarily BioShock. It's not just the game we're disappointed in though, but also the studio behind it, who found itself embroiled in controversy throughout the development and release of Atomic Heart. Accusations of players' data being handed to the Russian security services, allegations of pro-Russian sentiments, and a lack of condemnation for the invasion of Ukraine all landed developer Mudfish in hot water and further marred Atomic Heart's reputation. We stand with Ukraine here at Team TripleJump. Number 5. Forspoken. On paper, a game about a young woman who is transported from modern-day New York to a fantasy world and must use magical powers in order to find her way back home to her cat sounds like a fun time. You probably don't need me to tell you, though, that Forspoken doesn't exactly make good use of its premise. This Square Enix-published ARPG was released in January 2023, and the response from most outlets was tepid at best. The parkour system was a hit with several reviewers, one of whom said that it made Forspoken's otherwise empty world enthralling to traverse. This was about the height of the praise, however, and most journalists were quick to call out the game's slow start, one-note combat, and the fact that by the time a full range of abilities had been presented to the player, the game had all but ended. Then there was the dialogue.
Well, looks like this is the place. Seems like it's seen better days.
Well, you're not going to find what you're looking for out here.
I know.
The dialogue in Forspoken was some of the worst we've ever heard in a video game, being both poorly written and badly delivered. The game seemed like it had been written by aliens who had no idea how humans communicate with one another, and the game was memed into oblivion because of it. Number 4. Layers of Fear. Layers of Fear 2023 has already gotten off on the wrong foot with our writer, who gets irrationally angry when developers insist on giving video games the same name as their predecessors. It's annoying when it's a good game, and it's doubly so when it's a mediocre one. Layers of Fear 2023 is a remake of and a sequel to Layers of Fear and Layers of Fear 2, and gives players the opportunity to experience the stories of the painter and the actor once again, along with a new chapter which spins the yarn of the writer. Supposedly taking inspiration from PT and utilizing spooks from two reasonable horror titles, Layers of Fear 2023 should have been a decent spook fest, but players couldn't help but feel let down by the title. Some critics felt that the game executed both being a sequel and a remake quite well, and most agreed that the visual design was top-notch, but many felt that the new story was disappointing, especially when compared to the original Layers of Fear's plot, and a few even felt that it was seriously lacking in the tension department. If you're desperate to see the trilogy rounded off, then Layers of Fear 2023 is fine, but those seeking a groundbreaking horror experience should definitely look elsewhere. Number 3. Blood Bowl 3. If I told you that there was a game out there based loosely on American football but with tons of bloody violence and teams made up of various fantasy creatures, you'd probably think I'd had one too many sherries at the office Christmas party. What I've just described, however, is Blood Bowl, a tabletop game from Games Workshop, the makers of Warhammer 40k and the like. Naturally, the carnage of Blood Bowl is ripe for video game adaptation, and several titles have been developed over the years, including Blood Bowl 2009 and Blood Bowl 2. Since the launch of the latter, however, a new rule set has been released and fans have been waiting for a digital equivalent with bated breath. Unfortunately, Blood Bowl 3, which is based on the 2nd edition rule set, isn't very good. Issues started before the game was even released. Numerous delays meant that its launch was around 2 years late, and when players finally did get their hands on it in February 2023, they were less than impressed. Blood Bowl 3 was missing several features that were present in previous games. The AI was naff, bugs and glitches were plentiful, and to add insult to injury, the whole thing was riddled with microtransactions. I'd stick with the tabletop version if I were you. Number 2. The Last of Us Part 1 PC. Now, before anyone starts, we're purely talking about the PC port of The Last of Us Part 1 for this entry, mostly because the PS5 version was released in 2022, but also because that one was alright. The PC edition, which launched in March 2023, however, well, it was a bit of a mess. For an entire decade, the only way to experience all that The Last of Us had to offer was to buy yourself a Sony console. But in June 2022, it was announced that a remake was coming, and it would not only be available for PS5, but for PC as well. PC players were ecstatic and waited for the game with bated breath, only to be incredibly let down when it released 9 months later. The game was poorly optimized, suffered from a variety of technical problems such as inconsistent frame rates and frequent crashing, and had some pretty beefy system requirements to boot. On PS5, the game earned an average review score of 88 out of 100. However, on PC, it scored just 58. According to players, several patches and updates have fixed a lot of the problems, but the fact that the game launched with them at all was more than a little upsetting. Number 1. Redfall. Oh, Redfall. So much potential completely wasted. In the run-up to Redfall's release, it seemed like Bethesda and Arcane Austin, no relation to Tiny Peter, had a winning formula. A multiplayer shooter that takes place on an island beset by vampires? Heck yes! I've always wanted to shoot Edward Cullen in his stupid sparkly face. Alas, the formula was not winning, and there were a number of problems with Redfall right from the word go. Critics felt that the story was dull and the writing did little to make players actually care about any of the chapters. The missions were repetitive, the world design was uninspired, and to cap it all off, it was filled to the brim with bugs, glitches, and stupid AI. Furthermore, all multiplayer progress is tied to the host, meaning that if you want to continue playing without your favoured host, say because they died of boredom partway through the campaign, you'd have to replay all the missions you'd already completed. With more care and attention, Redfall could have at least been a fun multiplayer experience, but what players got was a half-baked mess with less bite than a basking shark. Redfall? More like Dreadfall? Got 'em.